For decades, Fred MacMurray was remembered as one of Hollywood's most dependable gentlemen. But Bob Hope knew him before the fame, before the fortune, and before more than 80 films made his face familiar across America. Years later, Hope finally opened up about the young man who once borrowed his top hat and cane for a Paramount screen test, and then became a movie star while Hope was still waiting for Hollywood to call. What began as jealousy turned into something far more emotional, because when Hope met MacMurray again in 1937, he discovered that success had changed almost everything, except the man himself. Before Hollywood, Bob Hope knew a different Fred MacMurray. Long before Fred MacMurray became one of Hollywood's most dependable leading men, Bob Hope knew him simply as another performer trying to find a way into show business. Their paths crossed on Broadway in 1933 during Roberta, the Jerome Kern musical that gave Hope one of his important early breaks. Hope played Huckleberry Haynes, while MacMurray appeared with the California Collegians and served as an understudy to Ray Middleton. Neither man could have known that within a few years, both would be working at Paramount. But MacMurray would get there first, and the way it happened became one of Hope's favorite stories. During the run of Roberta, Paramount talent executive Oscar Serlin arranged a screen test for MacMurray. He was told to appear in a tuxedo with a top hat and walking stick. MacMurray had the tuxedo but not the accessories, so he turned to Hope. Years later, Hope remembered MacMurray borrowing his high hat and cane for the test. Hope had already undergone his own disastrous screen test back in 1930, and Hollywood had shown little interest. So when MacMurray returned, asking to borrow the items again because Paramount wanted additional footage, Hope was amused rather than threatened. Then came the surprise. MacMurray received a standard 7-year Paramount contract and headed west. Hope jokingly recalled being irritated because Hollywood had rejected him while taking his friend. But roughly 5 months later, walking down Broadway toward the theater, Hope looked up at the Paramount marquee and saw something that stopped him cold. The Gilded Lily, starring Claudette Colbert, with Fred MacMurray prominently featured. Hope later admitted that he rushed to see the movie, almost hoping MacMurray would be terrible. Instead, he discovered the opposite. He was great, Hope remembered. MacMurray followed it with hands across the table opposite Carole Lombard, and Hope thought he was fabulous. The irony was impossible to miss. MacMurray had borrowed Hope's hat and cane to help open Hollywood's door. But when that door opened, Fred walked through it first. When Hope met him again, Fred was already a star. Bob Hope's story becomes far more revealing when he reaches 1937. By then, Fred MacMurray was no longer the shy musician from Roberta who had borrowed Hope's top hat and cane for a Paramount screen test. Hollywood had moved astonishingly fast for him. After signing with Paramount, MacMurray initially earned around $75 a week and spent months taking acting and diction lessons, appearing in tests, and wondering whether the studio would even renew his option. Then one movie changed everything. In 1935, director Wesley Ruggles cast him opposite Claudette Colbert in The Gilded Lily. Colbert had just won the Academy Award for It Happened One Night, so putting an inexperienced contract player beside one of Hollywood's biggest actresses was a considerable gamble. MacMurray was reportedly so nervous on his first day that Colbert immediately noticed, but she helped him relax, and audiences responded to exactly what Hollywood had almost overlooked: his natural, uncomplicated presence. The film succeeded, and suddenly Paramount had found a leading man who could stand beside powerful female stars without competing with them. The roles came quickly. MacMurray reunited with Colbert in The Bride Comes Home, appeared opposite Katharine Hepburn in Alice Adams, and began a 4-film partnership with Carole Lombard with Hands Across the Table. The same man who had once doubted that his screen test would lead anywhere was becoming one of Paramount's most reliable leading men. By the end of the 1930s, he had appeared in 23 films in only 5 years. Hope's position could hardly have been more different. His own first attempt at Hollywood had gone badly. After his 1930 Pathé screen test, Hope later joked that his nose appeared on the screen 10 minutes before the rest of his face. No movie career followed. He returned east, conquered vaudeville, Broadway, and radio, but the major Hollywood breakthrough MacMurray had achieved so quickly remained out of reach. So when Hope finally arrived in Hollywood in 1937, he admitted that one question was on his mind. What had success done to Fred? It was not an unreasonable concern. The young man Hope had known was now a genuine movie star, surrounded by famous actresses and working steadily at one of Hollywood's dominant studios. Hope later recalled encountering MacMurray coming around a set. 4 years had passed since their Broadway days. Hope was the newcomer now. MacMurray was established. Then Fred recognized him. "Hey!" MacMurray called out. According to Hope, Fred threw open his arms and hugged him. Decades later, that tiny moment was still powerful enough to make Hope emotional. "You want to cry," he recalled, because here was a man who had been working in Hollywood for years, a star now, yet greeted him exactly as the old Fred would have. That was the point of Hope's story. He wasn't really talking about the Gilded Lily, Carole Lombard, Paramount contracts, or box office success. He was answering a much more revealing question. What happens to someone when he finally gets everything he once wanted? In Fred MacMurray's case, Hope believed the answer was remarkably little. "And he's always been that way," Hope said, his affection unmistakable. "He's a beautiful, beautiful man." Coming from Hope, those words carry particular weight, because there could easily have been jealousy between them. MacMurray had literally borrowed Hope's hat and cane, taken a screen test, and reached Hollywood before the man who lent them to him. Hope even admitted that he once rushed to see MacMurray on screen, partly because he wanted to see how bad his old colleague was, only to discover that Fred was great. But whatever competitive feelings existed disappeared beneath something stronger: respect. And MacMurray had not even reached his peak. By 1943, he was reportedly Hollywood's highest-paid actor, earning $420,000 that year. Yet the following year, rather than protecting the wholesome image that had made him so valuable, he took one of the greatest risks of his career. Billy Wilder asked America's dependable nice guy to become an adulterer and murderer in Double Indemnity. The friendly man Bob Hope remembered was about to show audiences a side of Fred MacMurray they never imagined existed. The nice guy, who became one of Hollywood's coldest killers. The quality Bob Hope admired in Fred MacMurray, that ordinary, approachable decency, was also the foundation of MacMurray's screen image. Audiences trusted him. He had spent the late 1930s and early 1940s playing romantic leads and likable American men opposite some of Hollywood's greatest actresses. That was precisely why director Billy Wilder saw something far more interesting hiding underneath. In late 1943, Wilder wanted MacMurray to play Walter Neff in Double Indemnity, an insurance salesman who begins an affair with the married Phyllis Dietrichson, played by Barbara Stanwyck, and helps murder her husband for insurance money. MacMurray initially resisted. He understood exactly what audiences expected from him, and an adulterous murderer was almost the opposite of the Fred MacMurray they knew. Other actors had already been reluctant to take the role, and MacMurray worried that becoming Walter Neff could damage the career he had spent nearly a decade building. Wilder kept pushing. Eventually, MacMurray took the risk. When Double Indemnity arrived in 1944, the gamble paid off. Instead of destroying his image, the film revealed how deceptive that image could be. MacMurray didn't need to transform himself physically into a conventional villain. Walter still looked and sounded like a respectable American professional, which made his descent into murder even more disturbing. MacMurray later summarized his approach perfectly. He always began as Smiley MacMurray, the decent Rotarian type, until audiences gradually realized that the man they trusted was actually a heel. The performance became one of the defining roles of film noir. Yet despite Double Indemnity receiving 7 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture, MacMurray himself was not nominated for Best Actor. In fact, across a movie career spanning more than 80 films, he never received a competitive Oscar nomination. But Double Indemnity permanently expanded what Hollywood knew he could do. A decade later, he played the self-serving Lieutenant Tom Kiefer in The Caine Mutiny. Then, in 1960, Wilder used that trustworthy face against audiences again, casting him as the married executive J.D. Sheldrake in The Apartment. The gentleman Bob Hope remembered could convincingly become a killer, a coward, or a cheating executive the moment the camera rolled. That contrast may have been MacMurray's greatest trick. Hollywood spent decades treating his naturalness as simplicity, when it was actually what made him dangerous. He became rich enough to walk away, but chose a different kind of stardom. By the end of the 1950s, Fred MacMurray had already survived something few Hollywood leading men managed, more than 2 decades near the top. But his career appeared to be slowing. Between 1957 and 1959, he made 6 westerns, often modest productions far removed from the prestigious films of his earlier years. MacMurray disliked the genre and joked about the saddle sores. Then Walt Disney offered him a role that changed the direction of his career almost overnight. The Shaggy Dog arrived in 1959 and became an enormous commercial success, finishing among the year's biggest box office attractions. Suddenly, the man audiences once watched romance Claudette Colbert and Carole Lombard had become a favorite of American families. Disney followed with The Absent-Minded Professor in 1961, in which MacMurray played Professor Ned Brainerd, inventor of the gravity-defying substance flubber. Its success produced Son of Flubber in 1963, followed by other Disney projects, including Follow Me Boys in 1966. At almost exactly the same moment, television producer Don Feddersen approached MacMurray about My Three Sons. Fred repeatedly resisted because he had no desire to surrender his life to the exhausting weekly television schedule. Feddersen finally offered a remarkable solution. MacMurray would work only about 65 days per year, with his scenes for the entire season filmed first. The remaining cast would later complete scenes around his pre-recorded material, sometimes performing opposite a stand-in famously nicknamed Fred McMop. There was another powerful incentive. MacMurray reportedly received a 50% ownership interest in the series. He accepted, and My Three Sons debuted in 1960. Instead of becoming a short-lived retirement job, it ran for 12 seasons and 380 episodes, ending in 1972. The arrangement tells us something important about the man behind Bob Hope's affectionate memory. MacMurray had grown up watching his mother struggle financially after his parents separated. As an adult, he became famously careful with money, sometimes arriving on sets with his own brown bag lunch, and he invested heavily in real estate, including a large Sonoma County ranch. By his later years, the former $75-a-week contract player had become extraordinarily financially secure. Yet the lifestyle he protected was surprisingly ordinary: family, his ranch, golf, fishing, and time away from Hollywood. The young man who once needed Bob Hope's top hat to audition for Paramount had eventually reached the point where Hollywood had to redesign an entire production schedule around him. In the end, Bob Hope's words became Fred MacMurray's real eulogy. For all the success Fred MacMurray accumulated, his final years were far removed from the effortless figure audiences remembered. After My Three Sons ended in 1972, he gradually withdrew from regular work. His final theatrical appearance came in the 1978 disaster film The Swarm. By then, the man who had worked almost continuously since the 1930s had little left to prove. He had spent more than 4 decades on screen, starred in more than 80 movies, conquered television, and somehow done it without ever receiving a competitive Academy Award nomination. But retirement brought challenges that professional success could not solve. A lifelong heavy smoker, MacMurray developed throat cancer in the late 1970s. The disease returned shortly after Thanksgiving in 1987, although treatment again brought it under control. Then, just after Christmas in 1988, MacMurray suffered a stroke that affected his right side and his ability to speak. Months of therapy reportedly restored much of what he had lost, but his strength never completely returned. Those who knew him said something else remained intact: his humor. Don Grady, who had played Robbie Douglas on My Three Sons, continued calling his television father. Grady remembered that during their final conversation, MacMurray was too weak to come downstairs to the telephone, yet he could still joke. The easygoing personality Bob Hope had encountered more than half a century earlier was apparently still there. In November 1991, MacMurray developed a urinary tract infection that progressed into a serious blood infection. With his wife June and two of his daughters beside him, he died at 83. Years before that final chapter, Hope had already offered perhaps the simplest explanation for why MacMurray remained so beloved. When recalling their reunion after Fred had become a star, Hope became emotional. Success, he observed, could do strange things to people. But it apparently had not done that to MacMurray. "He's always been that way," Hope said. "He's a beautiful, beautiful man." That statement carries more weight when you consider everything MacMurray eventually possessed. He had fame, financial security, a long marriage, a sprawling ranch, hit movies, and 12 seasons of television. Yet when he turned 80 and was asked how he wanted people to remember him, MacMurray did not mention Double Indemnity, Disney, money, or awards. His answer was one word: fondly. And perhaps that is why Bob Hope's memory matters so much. He had known Fred before Hollywood had anything to give him, and was still describing essentially the same man after Hollywood had given him almost everything. Fred MacMurray never needed an Oscar to prove what kind of legacy he left behind. From the young performer borrowing Bob Hope's hat and cane to the Hollywood star Hope later called a beautiful, beautiful man, fame never seemed to erase the qualities his old friend remembered most. What do you remember best about Fred MacMurray? Double Indemnity, My Three Sons, or his Disney classics? Let us know in the comments, and subscribe for more untold stories from Hollywood's golden age.